University of Liverpool. And what I'm presenting on today is my PhD work, which looks at the value of serious literature in its ability to challenge stigma and promote double empathy understandings between autistic and non-autistic readers. So for context, I'm an autistic researcher, and any data that's been presented today has been analysed from a range of perspectives, so both autistic and non-autistic researchers on the team. So I won't spend too long on the theory of double empathy because, of course, the whole conference is quite comprehensive of that. But just for anyone who's joining now, when I talk about double empathy and promoting double empathy understanding, I'm talking about building a sense of a shared social reality to operate within between two individuals who are interacting within a social pair. And it's important to note that when the double empathy problem is looked at, non-autistic people are actually less likely to experience this in their everyday lives, so they're more likely to have mutuality. And this is due to the fact that it's believed that this breakdown in social understanding is more likely when you look at two people with very different social realities. So that is particularly profound for people with different neurotypes because we have different social realities of the world through our different perceptions. And two things come from this: the fact that autistic people are more likely to have to experience a lack of mutuality than non-autistic people. So the first is that autistic people are more likely to be blamed for the breakdown in any social communication. And non-autistic people, because they're kind of not as familiar with this, are more likely to assume that other people have the same norms as them when they enter a communication with somebody. And by contrast, autistic people, rather than using these very fast, rapid, heuristic-based approaches, are more likely to slowly and tentatively consider all possibilities within a social interaction. So, for example, if we're thinking about assuming what another person might be thinking and feeling, autistic people are more likely to take their time and be very careful in assessing this, whereas a non-autistic person might feel that there's a benefit and very quickly decide on what that person is most likely to be thinking based on their past experiences in a similar situation. So our approach is that this tentative version that autistic people take is more beneficial, enables more empathy by holding in more possibilities, more ambiguity. But in order to achieve double empathy, we need both people to be taking this approach rather than assuming that there are preset norms before interacting. So if we want to overcome the double empathy problem, which is what my research looks at, then we need to break this idea of neuronormativity. So this is a dominant idea within everyday society at the moment. And it's the idea that there is one typical and preferred form of human neurocognition, often referred to as being neurotypical. So within this approach, autistic people and other neurodivergent individuals are placed on how far they deviate from that norm. And so any differences are then perceived as deficits. And that gives way to stereotyping about what it means to be a part of that group. And that then eventually builds into stigma and othering towards autistic individuals. So by nature of the fact that autism has to be diagnosed and comes from the medical model means that there's inherently this neuronormativity approach that needs to be broken down. And what the view we take is, in order to promote double empathy, we need to break neuronormativity, and we also need to promote core neurodiversity. So this is the idea that rather than taking two people together and trying to encourage them to respect one another's norms, that we get them instead to just completely dismiss groupness. So to think about themselves as complex human individuals rather than an autistic and a non-autistic person. This is quite complicated because, first of all, these kind of dominant ways of thinking about social situations and pre-assumed norms is quite inbuilt within people and quite hard to break. And also, we don't want to result where non-autistic people just don't see difference, don't see neurodiversity, and start to reinforce their own norms kind of more strongly. So we need to make sure that non-autistic people in the research are dismissing their own groupness first, before thinking about kind of more possibilities as to what it means to be a part of another group, such as being an autistic adult. So it's argued that if we want to achieve double empathy in this way, then we need methods that are creative and that generally promote more openness of possibilities so that people can look beyond their separate identities. So we've been using serious literature to explore this kind of form of double empathy between individuals that's brought through from a general openness. So when I say serious literature, I'm not talking about highbrow fiction or anything like that, just fiction that engages with significant human emotions and experiences. So it doesn't matter kind of what genre this is from or whether it's fantasy or realistic. What matters is that the language within is very powerful and it jolts the readers out of any stereotype thinking. So any scripts and pre-assumed norms that they might have come in with. So this is pieces of text where you read and it either feels very akin to something you've experienced in the past, or alternatively, it feels realistic enough in its human emotion that it feels like a present reality that you are experiencing. And when we can jolt people out of their stereotype thinking, we can encourage them to hold on to ambiguity, which makes room for more empathic feeling, particularly with people who have different minds and perceptions than your own. So we know that this works very well within shared reading groups where readers come together and a trained reader reads aloud to bring this text into the room as a live present reality. And when these groups are run, we see that communal thinking results where readers think together within a similar framework as readers rather than any individual differences that they might have. And differences then explored through the individual different reactions to the text itself. So today what we're going to look at is whether reading alone can encourage non-autistic people to dismiss neuronormativity and be more empathetic towards autistic individuals, and also whether autistic and non-autistic people interacting together can find mutuality to achieve double empathy understanding. So the first study, I'm not going to run through everything, but today we're looking at the non-autistic participants for this study. So what participants did is they read 8 different short extracts, and it's worth noting that these studies often have smaller samples because there's a lot of data coming from each participant. So they read 8 different texts whilst they listened to an audio file of a trained reader reading those texts aloud. So that again created this live reality within the room. And then they filled out some short questionnaires and an interview where the focus was on getting them to point to areas of each text that moved them or surprised them in some way, so made room for that different way of thinking and empathizing with different minds. So this is just one theme from this research. And the theme was that we did actually see that both groups dismissed their normative frameworks and scripts that they were bringing into the literature. And it's important to note that this was different for autistic participants because quite naturally, as we expected, they were very tentative in their approach and they did hold ambiguity in a bit better. So they considered multiple possibilities for social information. But of course, autistic individuals, we were looking at adults and they had been kind of socialized to believe that this was wrong and that they should be assuming norms and they should learn these kind of scripted ways of interacting. So there was the self-consciousness there that their way of thinking was wrong that then had to be overcome. But for the non-autistic participants, they had to just overcome this idea that everybody has shared norms and ideas in social situations. So when they brought in their normative way of thinking, there was often overgeneralization. So for example, if a character in a social interaction couldn't achieve mutuality, they might point to a character and say, well, that person is just not good at socializing, isn't good at social situations and doesn't understand them. But what moved them out of this primarily was universal feeling. So this was parts of a text that they could point to and say, I think we all feel that. I think no matter who you are, you've experienced that emotion as a human. So even though not all the texts were kind of chosen to get them thinking about autism, some of them were kind of more generally about things like happiness, they were still starting to think about the fact that their view might relate to all other human beings, and that was kind of dismissing any idea of groupness or identity that they were holding on to. And this then moved them to challenge their norms, so to start thinking about why they believe norms to be kind of facts within a social situation and where that might have come from. And ultimately what we saw was that they were able to overcome generalizations and to start rethinking their norms and to be kind of more open in their approaches to things. So I'm just going to show an example. So here, this is an example of challenging the norm. So participant 28 just read an extract between 2 characters at a bar where there was a struggle for mutuality. And she says, we cringe, but surely we should be able to ask a drink recommendation from a bartender. if you were in a shop, you might ask a recommendation for a certain product, but social rules seem to make that exchange awkward in a bar setting. So she'd noticed that she was cringing and she challenged her own norms to ask, well, actually, why am I cringing? Why am I assuming that this is the wrong way to interact within a bar when in a different situation, so a shop, this wouldn't be inaccurate. So she was starting to rethink where those norms had come from and why she is perceiving this to be the wrong way to do things. So from this, we then quite quickly saw kind of people challenging their generalizations and starting to rethink their own norms. So participant 25 is an example of this. So they say, this shows that the concept of happiness is not a straightforward one, despite it seeming to be so. So this is them starting to kind of look at more general human emotions and situations and challenge these very quick, rapid ways of thinking about them in an almost prescriptive way. And to think about the fact that there might be different ways that different individuals find things like happiness and how they achieve that in their everyday lives. And this quite quickly then moved on to rethinking the way people viewed autism and autistic people, which was promoted by the fact that we had some texts within there that looked at autism directly. So 2 non-fiction texts were in there to later get people thinking about autistic perspectives. So participant 28 have read a lived experience text from Chris Packham and said, there are both positives and negatives, often in the eye of the beholder. So first of all, we've seen that they've dismissed neuronormativities to see that there's positives as well as negatives, and it's not about looking for the deficits and the deviation from the norm. But then they've also kind of went a bit further to realise that these positives and negatives are being imposed by an outside viewer within this neuronormative approach. So for the second study, what we did is autistic and non-autistic readers separately, first of all, read Of Mice and Men for a week. And then we brought them together in a longitudinal study. So they met 4 times across 4 weeks, where they would participate in hour-long sessions and they could discuss anything they wanted. So they were asked to bring in their diaries that they filled out while reading, which had their reflections to each chapter. But if they wanted to turn up each week and discuss kind of random social events, then they could do that instead. But every single pair decided to discuss the book and to get in depth into their reflections and to share them within the interaction. So we took some interviews at the end of this, but we also took kind of observation notes during each session, and participants continued to fill out questionnaires each week about their views of one another and their kind of groupness. So this research resulted in 4 different themes. So the first was that the book acted as social oil. So it provided mutuality to begin with. It gave a shared kind of space to interact within that kind of brought people outside of their normative view in a way where they could treat it as a kind of new emerging reality to work within. And from this, participants moved from thinking from a world of difference, so their groupness, to thinking to a world of affinity, so their similarities. So they were able to kind of look for shared identities as readers and to start finding that shared human complexity, and to then kind of instead thinking about the difference as an autistic and a non-autistic person, to think about their different approaches to the literature. And this resulted in emotional intelligence. So from thinking about one another to feeling with one another. So for example, the lived experience started off a kind of thinking with a person. So thinking with an autistic person if you were non-autistic. And then thinking with the characters and feeling with them through very difficult social and emotional situations, then kind of led to further disclosures within the lived experience discussions that resulted in a feeling together the same way they have with the characters. So having felt within the reality where the characters were perceived as kind of other minds within that situation, they were then able to extend empathy to different others. So there was a complete overcoming of othering as a result. And that resulted in moving from feelings of being overwhelmed to overcoming. So the autistic individuals had to overcome concerns about being stereotyped and being perceived as wrong. And the non-autistic individuals had to overcome stereotyping and othering towards autistic people. And it's worth noting at this point that none of our non-autistic individuals within the study had any kind of prejudice. They all came in with the view that being autistic is just something different and not something that's kind of wrong in any way. But they were still all very shocked by the end at how many stereotypes they told them without realising. So how much kind of implicit bias there was towards neuronormativity, which was then challenged. So this is a quote just to show the kind of mutuality that was achieved between participants. This was participant 10, who's non-autistic, and participant 18, who was autistic, within interaction with each other. So participant 10 says, our focus on society in the sessions has showed that we have more similarities than differences. It felt no difference socializing with my friends. And if I'd not known you were autistic, I'd have just thought we were different people individually. And participant 18 replies, I don't feel we are different from each other by much now, despite our neurological differences. So with this was a very kind of achieved shared empathy between participants as peers with very much human similarities rather than differences. And this is just to show an example of how non-autistic participants started to challenge their views then and their kind of generalized stereotypes about autistic people. So participant 10 says, maybe I overestimated the impacts that it, so being autistic, would have on what I would deem to be like a normal life. At the end of the day, whether you're diagnosed with something, it doesn't really matter. Everyone's different. So this was a participant who had come in with a very kind of positive view of autistic people, a very difference-based approach, and was still shocked at how much he'd overestimated kind of disability and not understood that that disability was built often within situations and through a lack of mutuality. So just to summarize our findings from these two studies, what we've seen is that literature does prevent stereotype thinking, and that's for two reasons. So first of all, it's argued that literature forces you to bite off more than you can chew. So you have to take on kind of a multitude of feelings and situations all at once, and that forces you to kind of break away from any quick stereotype thinking towards more careful holding of ambiguity, and that then kind of moves you to feel with other individuals. And across the studies, we've seen that literature promotes a more raw human thinking and feeling that completely cuts across any binary groups. So although there's a kind of respect for different identities and kind of a non-neuronormativity approach, there is a complete cutting across groups, which is what we wanted to see. And what we've seen kind of initially is that both reading alone and reading together does appear to move readers to overcome default ways of thinking. And it moves them ultimately towards thinking in a way that is more facilitative of double empathy when they come to interact with other neurotypes. However, we do need more research. So of course, if we want to look at how reading alone can be of benefit, so that's particularly important because we want people to kind of be ready to enter social situations with other neurotypes without making normative assumptions. Then we need to know kind of what conditions are going to be necessary to get people thinking outside of this norm. So of course, people read literature in their day-to-day lives and they don't necessarily achieve this. So one thing we argue is that people need to reflect, and that's the really crucial thing. So either through discussions with other people after they come away from reading or through a diary, we need people to kind of point to the places that have moved them and have challenged their thinking and to start reflecting on why that might be. And in reading together, we, of course, need to look at kind of other groups. So it's important to note that all of our participants were kind of educated to GCSE level, and in the paired study didn't have any kind of comorbid learning difficulties. So we need to see how that might work when it's kind of autistic people with more disabilities that are more likely to be stigmatized on top of being autistic. And also we really struggled to get participants outside of the gender binary norm for the longitudinal reading together. And so we need to look at why that might be and whether that relates to concerns about being stereotyped even further within intersectionality. So I'll finish there. I've left my contact details on the final slide, so you can email me at melissa.chappell@liverpool.ac.uk, and please let me know if anybody wants the slides, particularly if you want the slides with closed captions as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. That was just so amazing. It really, I have to say, I had read your papers already, and it's such a novel way of looking at this that is just great. But rather than me rambling on, people are really quite excited in the chat. So I'll read some of the questions that have been posted. Annabelle says, I really like this notion of moving from a world of difference to a world of affinity. How do you think this can be applied more broadly?
So that study was quite hard to think about the kind of generalization because, of course, we were purposely bringing people together to read together and think together. So there are a lot of reading groups like this, first of all, through the region organisation. So this is already kind of happening within society. But I think kind of if two people wanted to build this together, it'd be quite easy to read a text and kind of keep your notes down. So point to those places that moved you and then come together and discuss why that was and sort of compare your responses. So I think we need to start looking at kind of how we can build that into the community. So for example, in libraries and things like that, how can we get people coming together in this way?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Someone anonymous says, this is a very interesting study. I am curious, what options were available for communicating thoughts between participants?
So in the study where they were interacting, they all chose to come together and to kind of have verbal discussions together about the text with their written diary to rely on. So for example, if a participant didn't feel comfortable reading a certain thing aloud, they could kind of offer to show that diary to the other person, which did happen. And partly due to the pandemic and partly due to preferences, and two of the pairs decided to participate online. So like this, interacting like this, and two pairs kind of chose to interact together within a room. So those were the differences that we saw, really.
Thank you. Jinx is asking, can you speak to similarities, differences between reading versus watching TV movies as vehicles for increasing cross-neurotype understanding?
So that's really interesting. It's not something that we've actually looked at, but we assume that it's kind of, again, that powerful language that is jolting you out of the default ways of thinking. So certainly I think watching TV together will give you a shared experience to start to operate within, but you might not successfully move people outside of their kind of comfortable scripted ways of thinking as much as you could with literature. And it could be possible that you can achieve something similar or that has different benefits, but we just don't know that at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Lorna, a really wonderful use of creative methods, the social worlds of fiction to bridge the empathy gap. Thanks for an excellent talk. Jackie is asking, have you looked at the fan fiction world? It is a very interesting context where neurodivergent people, all people, meet and discuss their experiences.
So we did have a different study where we kind of had more participants and we just interviewed them about the ways that they read and the things that they read. And this is something that come up a lot, is that autistic people feel very comfortable within fan fiction communities. And also autistic people were kind of more engaging with fantasy and sci-fi. And partly this was why, because communities were bigger, there was more kind of option to extend the reading, to kind of considering that together with other people. So autistic people were already kind of doing this, so reading something and then taking it to interact with other people. And fan fiction seemed to be kind of a really good method of that. And I think there is kind of work ongoing from other research teams about the value of fantasy and how that might kind of translate.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Pascal, thank you very much. Brilliant research. How does the emotional side of reading literature come into the social interaction triggered by the reading? For example, surprise or anguish?
So part of the reason is that kind of when people come together, they're still, so obviously they were still kind of talking about the text and the characters, and people were really getting within to the minds of the characters in the text and feeling through them as though they were real people. So when kind of a social discussion stemmed outside of that between the two individuals, they were still very much thinking and feeling through the character, who was kind of this unspoken presence in the room. So they were able to then kind of extend that towards the other person. So rather than kind of approaching it in a very kind of rapid and quick way, there was more careful thought. So one example I can think of was an autistic participant kind of disclosed an experience of racism. And because the text kind of addresses racism between disabled characters, they were able to kind of draw what they'd just been feeling together about this character who'd been racially discriminated, to then feel with one another about that situation. And there was a really profound empathy that came out of that, actually, as a result of moving from the character into the mind of the other person that they were talking to.
Thanks, right. Dave says, great presentation, share interest, and this is more a comment than a question. Shared interest has long been a space in which the mutuality can occur, which I totally agree with. And Christine, she says, I find it really interesting that autistic people and neurotypical people interact well in this context, where they're given a framework within which to interact, specifically discussing a book. It reminds me of how autistic people often find tabletop role-playing games a congenial way to socialize because of the inherent structure of the games. Do you see any similarities here?
Yeah, definitely. And I think as well, that's a really interesting area that I would love to see some more research, because it's, again, that fantasy world where you're encouraged to think about these multiple possibilities. So that's another creative method that could be really beneficial.
Yeah, I think it's kind of the principle of it, the actual activity, as long as this encourages this kind of collaborative discussion and thinking about and role playing and so on. I think it's, yeah. Gilly asks, is this why arts therapies have been used a lot in with autism?
So I don't know as much about arts therapy or why that's implemented. I think the papers that I've read have been more about kind of encouraging self-expression rather than trying to bridge a sense of mutuality, but it could be that it's being used that way.
And Easy asks, I'm wondering if we could incorporate people using AAC?
Yeah, so we're currently thinking about applying for postdoctoral funding to look at these sorts of things, because of course there was a huge gap in the research in that we didn't have people with different ways of communicating, people with extra learning difficulties or kind of particular struggles with reading. So we really do kind of want to look at that and see if we can incorporate those sorts of technologies and if it will work in the same way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Sorry, there's a lot of questions. Emily asked, says, I feel very strongly about trying to move away from the intervention focus on autistic young people in school. The clear need to develop mutual understanding as per double empathy problem suggests there is a scope to work more directly with neurotypical students in schools. This is such a creative methodology. I wonder if it would be effective with children, young people too.
So I imagine it would. We limited our sample to people over the age of 18 just for kind of ease of getting the sample mainly. But I think a lot of teachers have gotten in touch with me and said that they are doing this sort of thing and they are seeing the benefits. So I think certainly it probably does work well within schools.
Okay, just one more because we are running out of time. Just a thought, I wonder if this is a type of hyper-focus or the external stimulus is cut away, leaving space for mutual interaction.
So we did have a separate kind of part of the research that looked at that, and what we found is that the reason autistic people do so well with literary reading, so we found that autistic people read literature in a kind of a much better, more empathetic way than the non-autistic people kind of come in with from the start. And that's because partially there's an ability to hyper-focus on detail and hold that detail in for longer, and to kind of reflect on that more rather than kind of very quickly trying to make your way through a story and look for the key points and kind of predict what's coming next in a way that's lost any detail and kind of emotion that's held within a particular phrase, for example.
Thank you. Really, thank you for a wonderful talk. And I'm hoping you can contribute to the discussion panel later on, and any questions that I couldn't read out that can be answered there or then in writing. But now I would really like to welcome Brett Hisman,